Mr. Sinha, while COVID, particularly in the second term of the Modi government, did affect the economy, especially growth rates, the fact is post-demonetization, and we're talking from the first quarter of 2017, there was a slowing down, in fact, across 9 consecutive quarters. Have there been missed opportunities in the last 10 years, which today the finance minister perhaps glossed over? Or do you see it as macroeconomic stability and the possibility of growing faster in the years to come?
So, Rajdeep, let me pick up on 3 points that Shashiji made. The first point that he made, and I think he needs to check his numbers, is when he said that China is growing faster than India. I don't believe that is correct, and he quoted some other countries. I think he should look very carefully at the numbers, because the reality is that India is the fastest growing large economy in the world.
That's right.
So I'm not sure whether those numbers are correct. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 about real rural wages. Again, I'm not sure exactly what is the best way to look at rural prosperity. I would suggest that the better way to look at it is rural consumption plus transfers. And that's a very important distinction, because we have major fiscal transfers going into the rural economy that may not show up in wages, but will show up in consumption and will show up in overall prosperity. And these transfers include the money that go through the Kisan Samman Nidhi, which is 6,000 rupees a month. It's the money that goes through Narega as well. So we have to look at all of these transfers and then do a before and after comparison to see whether the rural economy is doing well. I can only offer my anecdotal observation from Jharkhand, which is one of the poorest states in India, and I can certainly tell you that our rural economy 10 years later is flourishing compared to where it was 10 years before. And this is with a JMM Congress government that is notoriously corrupt and incompetent. So even then, because of all that we have been able to accomplish in the economy, I think when you look at actual prosperity, rural prosperity, you'll find that it has genuinely gone up. And in fact, there's another statistic which says that if you look across India, real incomes have gone up by 50%. So yes, we can play around with the numbers, but again, if you go and you ask people, they'll tell you that their lived experience has demonstrated a very significant improvement over the last decade. And then let me pick up a third point that Shashiji brought up, which is to say that we have not grown fast over the last 5 years. That is entirely because of COVID, because we actually had minus 7% GDP growth during the COVID year and another slowdown the year after. That's a huge hit to take. And obviously, because we took that hit in the last 5 years, the last 5 years of growth is low. But when you look at it over the last 10 years, it evens out quite a bit and we can take COVID out. Again, this was a once-in-a-century pandemic, which is unprecedented. The global financial crisis, which is what the UPA had to deal with in 2007 and 8, was a once-a-decade crisis. This was a once-in-a-century crisis, and almost everyone has praised the way India handled it at a macroeconomic level. So I think our economic management has been absolutely outstanding.
You know, it's interesting that when you have two fine minds, they can cherry pick the numbers that suit them. As I said, from 2017 to 20 also there was a slowdown. This was pre-pandemic. But let's look at the next question on handling of the economy. Who has handled inflation better? And if I look at that, clearly from 2004 to 14, it was an average of 8.1%. This is consumer inflation. 2014 to 23 under NDA, it came down substantially, 5.7%. Now, here you could argue that the NDA had favorable tailwinds, especially with oil prices coming down. But Shashi Tharoor, often the UPA or the opposition has criticized this government for rising prices for inflation. But one of the real achievements, many would say, of the Modi government is that they've never allowed inflation to go out of hand, unlike what happened after the global financial crisis when inflation entered double digits during UPA 2 in particular.
Okay, first, Rajdeep, since you gave Jayant a chance to respond to me, but not me a chance to respond to Jayant, let me just stress. I did check my numbers. They're accurate. Over the last 5 years, indeed, our growth rate is only 3.5% cumulatively. And all the other countries I mentioned also had COVID. We're not the only country in the world to experience COVID. Once in a century pandemic, they all were hit by it. They've done better than us. So let's understand that we shouldn't be patting ourselves too much on the back. That was on that particular issue. But coming to inflation, the fact is that our retail inflation, measured by the CPI, rose to 7.44% in July of 2023. And there's a survey by Kantar this month which says that 57% of Indians are worried about rising prices, which is a significant increase from 27% last year. Why are people worried? Go and take a look at the wholesale markets. In December 2023, you're talking about 5%, 6% inflation. Do you know that the wholesale markets in December 23 were 19.6% higher when it comes to food items like pulses compared to the same month the previous year? Paddy was 10.5% higher, milk is 7% higher, and vegetables in December 23 were 26.3% higher than in December 22. What does this mean? It means that for the Aam Aadmi to go to the market, he cannot afford to buy, or she cannot afford to buy, the same vegetables and pulses and doodh that she was buying for her family 1 year ago with the same amount of money. And the problem is her income hasn't gone up. Incomes have not gone up across the country. That's why this talk about inflation and GDP and per capita income is completely illusory when you look at the real experience of ordinary people in India today.
Jayant Sinha, your response to what you've just heard. As I said, I've looked at a 10-year horizon, Dr. Tharoor, so therefore over 10 years, clearly the numbers here of the NDA are much better than the UPA. You're looking presumably at what's happened in the last 12 months, but Mr. Sinha, respond.
So Shashiji, of course, as you said earlier, Rajdeep, is very eloquently cherry-picking data because, as he himself said, the lived experience is consumer price inflation. It's not wholesale price inflation. If you see that wholesale prices are going up, then there are a whole host of measures which, in fact, our government has utilized to keep consumer inflation in check by releasing stocks, by controlling prices, by importing food grains and other food items. So by all of those ways, we have managed to keep consumer inflation much lower. And in fact, if you find that one sort of set of goods and services are going up in prices, you have to look at a composite basket. And there, for instance, if you look at oil prices, petrol prices, you look at other prices that constitute the consumption basket, there are many things you can do to make sure that your overall consumption basket price does not increase as much, which is effectively what the data is telling you. So yes, you can pick December WPI and cherry pick that data and say it's at 20%, but you have to look at the overall impact on individuals. But let me come back to a very important point that Shashiji is bringing up, and that is to ask ourselves, how is the median person doing, right? And you can talk about this data or that data. Ultimately, you have to ask, what are people's sentiments? Are they satisfied with the government in its overall economic management and its overall policies? And the best and statistically the most accurate way to look at that is to actually look and see what voters are doing. And voters have just been very, very much in support of the NDA government and have rejected UPA governments. So that is a composite sense of people's sentiment in terms of whether they're feeling like the government is delivering for them or not, whether the performance of the government is acceptable or not. So to my mind, that is the ultimate litmus test.